Welcome to episode 166 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we walk you through the Epicurean texts and we discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you too find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. Today we are very pleased to bring you a very special interview with Dr. David Glidden, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at the University of California, Riverside. Dr. Glidden has written numerous articles of interest to fans of Epicurus, including Epicurean Prolepsis in the 1985 Oxford Studies in Classical Philosophy, Epicurean Thinking, and in addition, many others related to Epicurus, which we encourage our listeners to seek out. Epicurean Prolepsis, or anticipations or preconceptions, or whatever you prefer is the best word for the topic, is one of the three legs of the Epicurean canon, but one of the most difficult subjects for many people to understand as they study Epicurus. We think you're really going to enjoy hearing Dr. Glidden's unique and challenging take on the subject, and we think it's going to prompt many of us to take a new look at what the standard commentators, even Diogenes Laertius himself, have had to say about the subject in the past. Dr. Glidden's approach promises to lead to a much deeper and rewarding understanding of many aspects of Epicurus that are often overlooked today. We can't thank Dr. Glidden enough for his time in talking to us about his work, and we hope to be able to talk to him again in the future. So if you have questions or comments, please be sure to post them in the thread at EpicureanFriends.com. Now, let's speak with Dr. Glidden. Dr. Glidden, who's with us today, has generously allowed us to call him David. David, we don't know much about you other than what we have read in your articles about Epicurus, and I think you have a LinkedIn profile, and I know that you were associated with a university in Riverside, California, but other than that, we know very little about you, and so what do you think would be appropriate for our listeners to hear to introduce you to our audience?
Well, gosh, I got interested in Epicurus in graduate school because I had gone to Germany to study a different topic on a dissertation research on Plato's unwritten teachings, there's a tradition about that, but I found I was more attracted to pursuing the notion of Epicurean materialism. And at that point, I don't think anyone was writing in philosophy on that as a dissertation topic for many years. So I got interested in that. I'm basically a philosopher / philologist. So I occasionally teach classics courses when I was teaching. I taught at the University of California at Riverside for a long time, but I also taught occasionally at UCLA and UCSD and Irvine whenever they needed someone with my expertise to teach their graduate students. But basically, I'm also interested in living a good life and living in community. And one thing I'm struck, you started with Norman Wentworth DeWitt's old book, which was not really a scholarly book, but he had lots of insights. And one of the things I liked about him was he pointed out that Epicurean garden communities became a kind of model for Benedictine communities, and that he saw the core of Epicureanism as a group of people living together away from the rest of the world, trying to find peace of mind. And I think that's also what attracted me later to classical Buddhism. They say in Buddhism there's 10,000 Dharma doors, 10,000 variants of what Buddhism is. Sometimes Buddhism involves reincarnation, but classical Buddhism did not. When you die, you die, but your spirit may live on in terms of those you've influenced. And so that's very true of Epicurus' spirit living on, and why Lucretius can almost deify him in his poem. So there was a certain affinity for Epicureanism and then Buddhism and a way of life which leads to living in the present moment and living without fear that influenced me. And at one point I had planned to become a Benedictine monk. And so I understood what Norman Wentworth DeWitt was talking about living in community. And that's true of Buddhism as well. And I think one of the things that's challenging about Epicurus is we tend to focus on the metaphysics and epistemology as heavily on the ethics. But he says over and over again to his public writings in these letters that if the main point of his enterprise is for Epicurus and his community to live lives free from anxiety and stress and to find peace of mind with each other. So it involves living in a community where you know people you're living with and you care for each other. And he says at some point, on several occasions, that if atomism doesn't do that for you, then give it up and do something else, find another different metaphysics. So he's really totally focused on quality of life and what it is to be a good person, which I think in my experience of the Benedictine life is essential to them, a little bit less essential perhaps because they're wrapped up in metaphysics, but certainly for the classical Buddhism, the original Buddhist communities were trying to live selfless lives in a larger world. What makes Epicurus different from the Stoics is that for Epicurus, he doesn't really try to intervene in the larger world. He's very apolitical. So he lives in his garden communities in the desert, well away from, these subsequent Epicurean communities, well away from the interference of politics. So people could find a haven for themselves in a kind of commune life, which working and living together would give them peace of mind. But they live in community, but they don't try to engage in the world community, even though Christianity and Buddhism and Stoicism all try to engage in that larger community. I don't know if that's answered your question, but it shows you the background of where I came from into this. And I spent 20 years, it's a long time ago now, working on Epicurus very methodically and very rigorously. And I admire your patience in going through these letters. If you're a Greek philologist, as I've also been, the letters are extraordinarily challenging. Nearly every word is open to a different interpretation. He's using words differently. And so dozens of scholars have come up with different readings of Epicurus. And one thing interested me over the years was that when you confront a philosophy which does not believe in a Platonic soul and does not believe in the mysteries, as it were, of spirituality, as later developed in Plato and earlier in Plato and others, it's hard to fathom it. And so when I was working on Epicurus, philosophy of mind at Princeton and other institutions was just evolving to understand about neurology. They were just beginning to identify the mind with neurology, which took a long time to have that happen. So people who are interested in the mind in the way Descartes was, there's a soul in the body, but the soul is somehow a different function of the body than the brain. They found it difficult to understand Epicurus and easy to dismiss him. And what interested me was that Epicurus had the great insight into the physical nature of human beings and all other critters. And he did not try to elevate human beings above other animals. And that was, it turned out, the wave of the future or the insight of modern science, although it's an insight that's hard for people to grasp. So they often reinterpreted Epicurus to project back into him a notion of consciousness like a Platonic soul or a Stoic soul, where a reasoned being is separate from the neurology of that person. And that struck me as wrong because I didn't agree with that view. And I could see how people could misinterpret Epicurus. So my 20 years of articles on Epicurus were met with a great deal of confrontation and disagreement. And it's nice to see that people like them now. My only success was that my work on Epicurus was often taught in medical school at Harvard about a model of human nature, which is compatible with what they were doing with neurology. So that was some satisfaction, but it's funny that it takes about 35 years for people to catch up with what I was thinking about at the time. But it was a different era, and we're now much more appreciative of the subtleties of neurology and how it affects our personalities. And so Epicureanism works well. That's why I got interested in it, if that makes sense. And by the way, I should warn you that sometimes I mumble, professors do. So let me know if you're not hearing me clearly.
Yeah, you sound very good. And it's clear to me, even though you worked on this a long time ago, you clearly have not lost your edge on this subject. You're sounding very, very clear and very intelligible. So, and it's excellent stuff. So thank you for that. Don, I think you had a question about how, and he sort of just answered it, about how Epicurean psychology, theory of cognition, how that relates to modern theories of cognition.
Yeah, exactly. I've been really interested recently in reading about it because the reason that what you came to our attention, I think, were your papers on prolepsis, and that I found, at least for myself, and I have a couple other people on the forum that sort of have seen parallels between Epicurean prolepsis as well as the modern idea of the brain as a prediction engine, that it would take too long to react to things if we just waited for our sensory input to actually govern our actions. But whereas the current research seems to be that the brain will set up sort of an image of the world over time, and it will compare incoming sensory images or sensory input to what it already has in store and will react on that. And the classic example seems to be that if you're walking in the woods and you see a long, skinny thing on the ground, you may automatically jump away from it and think it's a snake. Whereas if you look at it closer, then you see that it's a stick. But your brain has sort of prepared you to react to the outside world in this, forest environment. You might see snakes. If you see a snake, that's going to be dangerous. So we need to be sure we stay away from it. But the whole idea of the brain as a prediction engine and the parallel with the Epicurean Prolepsis is one of the things, at least, that has been rolling around in my mind. And I don't know whether you are familiar with that particular line of research or not, but if you see any parallels between modern research like that and the Epicurean mechanistic worldview with the brain and that sort of thing.
Thanks for asking that, because Epicurus and the Greek skeptic Sextus Empiricus worked together. Sextus in the 22nd century of our era, but was making a lot of use through his predecessors of Epicurean arguments. The Stoics took the word prolepsis and stole it and used it in a very different way, as a conceptual recognition. And when I was in graduate school eons ago, the idea was to recognize something is to have the idea or concept of that thing. Otherwise, you don't recognize it. And I grew up in farming country, and I began to respect the ability of animals, cows, pigs, and so forth, and also pheasant, if I was hunting them, to figure out who I was and what to do and how to respond. The pheasant learned never to fly, because no hunter shoots an animal on the ground, a bird on the ground, so they just run ahead of me. I didn't have a dog which would get them to get up in the air, so it was a failure. But the thing was, the Stoics in modern philosophy until fairly recently thought that to see something and recognize it as a kind of thing requires having a concept of that kind, which means you have to have language, thought, consciousness, and so forth. But anyone who works with animals recognizes that animals recognize things as kinds, even if we don't want to say they have definitional concepts because they don't have language. So my dog would always distinguish dogs from non-dogs. So we have coyotes here. So occasionally walking my dog, he'd always sort of yearn or wag or bark at other dogs. But when he saw coyotes, he realized this was something to be afraid of and to stick close to me. It was a big dog, so the two of us would always overpower the one coyote, but he recognized that they were different. And animals do that, and they have to do it quickly. They can't just reassemble all their different sense data because they'll get killed. So pattern recognition is essential. And it's essential with bees and with ants and the entire animal kingdom. And apparently it's true of plants too, recognizing where food is in which part where its roots are growing. Now, that means they don't have a conscious thing, I think I'll go over there. They're not human minds the way we are because we have language. But it was really important to recognize pattern recognition as a non-cognitive device, which could be wrong, which we share with all animals. It was ingenious of Epicurus to invent this, to see it. But what offended most people in that era for the history of humanity was that we are supposed to be different from the animals. We're Adam, we name the animals, we're in charge of them. We are very different critters than they are. And when people started working in primate research, this caused problems because primates could do lots of things humans can do. Parrots, I wrote a paper once and gave it in Italy about a parrot that could use language and how it used language. In my Epicurean semantics paper, you might see a reference to it. And so it took a real evolution of philosophers to catch up with what neurologists were doing and people in animal psychology, recognizing how animals, it's essential that they be able to respond to patterns. And this applies also probably to plants as well. In Riverside, we've been having a drought, and on some years it's been very, very hot. So a couple of years, some of the trees have lost their leaves. At least one species it hasn't. And I knew it was going to be an unusual winter when they lost their leaves early this year. And we've had one of the coldest winters we've had since I've been in Southern California. So pattern recognition is an important device for refiguring what it is to have a mind. And it thereby liberates us to think of dolphins, orcas, primates, dogs, bees, even nematodes as having the ability to do this, or snails. One of my colleagues working on snails, a philosopher, to see how we've sold out of our anthropomorphism the actual intelligibility and the sophistication of perceptual recognition in animals and in plants, probably. And so it's been exciting to follow this. It has been extremely frustrating when I first came out of graduate school to have people say, well, that doesn't make sense. Epicureans are sort of fools, or they didn't know what they were doing. And occasionally someone would, the great leaders of my field working on Epicurus were not materialists or didn't understand philosophical materialism as I had, because I was lucky enough to have teachers like Richard Rorty teaching me this. And so it was frustrating to see the controversies, and it made me sense the controversies that Epicurus faced, why he went to his garden, because he was running against the whole tradition of Roman and Athenian philosophy. There was nothing like it, because he was providing a working model of how you could do science with hypotheses. And what's in the history of philosophy, I'm going on a bit too long on this perhaps, in the 17th century, Gassendi, who's a Catholic bishop, and he's also a devout Catholic, starts reading Epicurus and Lucretius. Lucretius is a forbidden writer, and starts dismantling Aristotelianism with the wisdom of a completely material world, where there's no sort of unusual material like pneuma, which is what the Stoics and Aristotle seized upon as something like a spirit, the spirit of life. And then Boyle comes around and starts doing these corpuscular hypotheses about the nature of reality that avoided him from being in danger for heresy. Epicureanism makes it into England through translations which are largely represented as someone else's new view, so again, to protect them. And so mechanical views of nature start developing, but there was always this resistance until the late half of the 20th century for a thoroughgoing materialism, which eliminates certain ideas that have badly infected humanity. And I saw this happening in graduate school. I was fortunate enough to be interested in neurology from reading the Scientific Americans, which I did religiously for a long time till it got too complicated. I had the time to do it. So it was greatly an evolution in my life. And it's been heartening to see that this model of an atomic world is now occupying more and more people's minds. The challenge is how to reestablish a moral outlook if we're just neurological engines, how to understand mental deficiencies. And lately I've been interested in what are called neurovariants. People, for instance, on the spectrum of what's called autism are different because their neural structures are different. And so instead of trying to say, why aren't they like us? The question is to try to understand who they are, how they are that way to the extent that we can, and to realize that that's going to be always a barrier with people who have neurological structures are different of ours. So we can't say that a primate is going to be like us, an ape or a chimpanzee. All of these are very different people, and even with humanity within any one primate species, everything is different. And the Epicureans hit on that, but their neurological system of just atoms and special kind of fire atoms is still too primitive to be persuasive. And poor John Locke and his friend Sydenham were persuaded that Epicureanism was correct. And then they learned about the microscopes that were being used in the Netherlands. And Sydenham, a great physician of his time, agreed with John Locke there was no point to looking at water in a microscope, where they saw all these little things moving around, like cholera, bacteria, and parasites, because they weren't atoms. So without eyes that could see atoms, it was just a waste of time. It was an amusement. So Epicureanism has led people astray terribly. Only molecular chemistry is what saved it, because we could see constructions which are found in Lucretius, an understanding of the complex semina which produce what we would call molecules. And you could see why that was a saving grace for the advancement of science. But although Epicurus was able to produce a materialist philosophy, it took a long time for that to be evolved into modern subatomic particles, and now a world where energy is more important than particles. And we have a new evolving theory of the world, which will make Epicureanism look too primitive. So there you have it.
That's great.
This is going to be extremely challenging because everything you've just said would lead us off into an hour-long discussion of the many fascinating topics that you've just mentioned. And I can see the questions spinning in the minds of everybody else who's on the panel here. Let me ask you this. We found out about you because of your articles on Epicurean Prolepsis and Epicurean thought. And we, again, have a lot of listeners who are relatively new to Epicurus, new to philosophy in general. And they don't understand the larger picture of where prolepsis fits into Epicurean philosophy. In other words, we talk about Epicurus and his so-called canon of truth. And we always say, well, it has three legs. It has the five senses. Everybody understands that. The feeling of pleasure and pain. Everybody understands that. And then we say, the third leg is prolepsis, or anticipations, and we get a blank stare because nobody has a real understanding of what that meant in terms of a test of truth. And so if we could backtrack, I know we're going to be talking a lot about pattern recognition, as you've already stated, but can you help us go back and take a look at what problem was Epicurus trying to solve in coming up with prolepsis? And you've hit on it already a little bit as well about what Plato and Aristotle had been doing. But in our discussions among people who are sort of generalists, they don't have a perspective on why this issue is important and where it came in, why Epicurus developed it, and what he was answering in the prior philosophers by discussing this. And of course, we read different articles from different people, and everybody's got a different opinion to some extent about what prolepsis means. Your explanation in your articles, I think, has interested us far more than anyone else, because as you've said, you're not going with the Stoic flow in terms of seeing the conceptualization process as all there is to Epicurus and prolepsis. So can you help us at sort of an introductory level? What was Epicurus doing in regard to this canon of truth, and how does prolepsis fit into it?
Great topic. Let's say you're a materialist. You think all that exists are atoms in motion in the void. You're a combination of atoms. There's atoms affecting you, but you're not blind. You're not unable to respond to what's happening to you. So things are affecting your body through your senses, eyes, and so forth. And how do you then gain understanding of what's happening to you? And the first way you'd go about doing this was you wouldn't be interested in psychology of ideas, you'd be interested in physiology. Now, Epicurus borrowed heavily from Aristotle, who was also interested in the physiology of perception and how senses affect the body. Aristotle made mistakes. For instance, he thought that the eyeball, the iris or the lens in the eyeball, was a stopper, like a bottle stopper, to keep the vitreous liquid in the eye from flowing out. He didn't know about lenses. Error. But what he did know was that particles, waves of light, hit the eye like a pebble in a pond, and that pond then repeats that rhythm in the vitreous liquid of the eye, which then produces a pattern against the retina, which produces the sensation of seeing color at night, just black or white. And that was a completely physiological account of how perception works, independent of the ideas we have that we see through language. Epicurus ran with that. So Epicurus was primarily interested in the physiology, and this comes through in Lucretius especially, of how, if the outside world is bombarding us, how we can then respond to it and live and survive. And so how is it that we know what's happening outside of us? So we argued that our senses will never lie to us. Now, in philosophy, that's called direct realism. What happens to us is what we see, but that's still a conceptually imbued point of view. What he meant by that is there's a causal mechanism which methodically hits us in such a way that what we experience is true of that causal mechanism. So that's why we see hallucinations. A tower in the distance, which is square, looks round. The pixelization of light, which we now know because of computers, but people who worked with lenses knew that earlier, cause us to see things that way. So when the sun is going down, gradually it becomes square because of the effect of the light on us. And what's happening is what we're seeing is true to the cause. Now, the cause may not be the way we're conceiving it to be, but it's an attempt to explain the physiology of perception. Aristotle was fascinated with, and Epicurus took that up with a thoroughgoing mechanism. The trouble for Aristotle was, is there then a little homunculus, a little person in the mind, translating those impulses and saying, you're looking at an elephant, say. And so that's why Descartes, who was also in his original works, this discourse on method is an introduction to a book on optics. And Descartes was interested in the physiology of perception, like Aristotle. But at one point, Descartes says, and then we get to human minds, which then interpret what's happening. So what made Epicurus interested in perception and the truth of perceptions was he was interested in the causation of sensory effects on our body from information from the outside. Information being like data, as it were, not interpreted. Pattern recognition is to grasp something in anticipation of what the rest is going to be. And we couldn't survive as animals if we couldn't do that. But we can also make mistakes. So although the pathe, our feelings, pathe in Greek means paskein, what you're undergoing. So it means what's happening to you physically. And our perceptual organs, what's happening to us via their organs. They're always going to be true to their cause. But prolepses are guesses made by the sensory organism of what's going to happen next. And as a consequence, it can be wrong. So this was an entirely neat, coherent theory of how the physiology of perception works, with the important innovation that we have to act on limited information. And so we anticipate through experience, through many times being exposed to seeing dogs, that that's a dog and not a coyote. So I'm going to go over and try and pet it. But I'm not going to do that to a coyote. And so this, you could see, to the Stoic world, got quickly turned around into a Platonic idea system where there's a little interpreter in the mind looking at all this stuff and coming up with a mental analysis. And for them, then the prolepses were concepts of natural kinds, the way Aristotle or Plato had developed. Now, none of you are as old as I am, but when Disneyland started, when on Sunday nights had a Disney program every Sunday night, competing, I think, with 60 Minutes, and I always wanted to watch the Disney program. And they had a film about the mind, and it was based on a person sitting answering a telephone inside the human brain. And he'd get all this information, he'd pick up all these phones, figure out what's going on, and then respond. And that was the faulty view of the human mind. It's not entirely faulty, but the misleading view that dominated from Plato onwards, with the exception of the Epicureans. So the Epicureans were offering a different kind of an alternative, borrowed with a great deal of vocabulary and so forth from Aristotle's account of the physiology of perception. Just a brief digression, a bunch of us on the West Coast were working on Aristotle's theory of perception for several years out of a Stanford Berkeley seminar. And I finally I was working the more advanced of us, writing it up. And I wrote it up and went to an East Coast seminar. And people were horrified about what we were doing on the West Coast. we were talking about the physiology of perception rather than ideas. And there's an enormous gap that happens to people when they have to move from thinking about the mind and its ideas, which has influenced Western culture from the beginning, to thinking about the neurology of pattern recognition, why animals behave the way they do, why people who are neural variants behave the way they do, and why neurotypicals behave the way they do. And that's a very mind-boggling, confusing state. So it's not surprising that prolepses got reinterpreted in different ways. But otherwise, it's a very simple thing. It's animals have senses bombarding them. They're responding to those senses. They like to get a thorough understanding, is that a snake or a stick? But if they wait and get too close to a rattlesnake, that'll be the last recognition they'll have. And so prolepsis is an ability to recognize patterns. Fish do this all the time, and you fool them with bait. A shiny metal would get a bass anytime, even though it's not a fish at all, but they make mistakes. So the thing to bear in mind about Epicurean criteria is that the senses are reliable. The pathe, or what's happening to our feelings, what's physically affecting us, is reliable. And then they also talk about these atomic visions we get in our brain. They're true to the causes coming from the outside. But the prolepses, although part of our criteria, are not criteria of truth. They're criteria of tentative guesswork about the world, only it's not intellectual guesswork. It's anticipating, is this what the person's going to say next? And I think I said in one of my emails to you that we all know people who try to complete our thoughts. Sometimes I speak slowly and I have a stutter. So when I was little, people would always try to complete what I said. And you read newspapers, we get older, you see a few letters and you think it means the word is different than it is. You make mistakes about vision because your brain starts making errors of pattern recognition the way it wouldn't have earlier because your attentiveness is decreasing. So that's a long answer to a very good short question.
Thank you. I know we have all sorts of follow-up questions on that, but before we go to the follow-up, just as I was saying a minute ago, that people don't understand how prolepsis fits into the Epicurean scheme of things. One thing they read in Diogenes Laertius is that Epicurus rejected dialectical logic. And there seems to be a controversy between Epicurus and the Platonists especially, but then made even worse probably by the Stoics, about this role of logic. And so we try to be very careful in our discussions because Epicurus says reason is a very important thing for living life properly as well. But people get confused. They say, well, how can Epicurus endorse reason but reject dialectical logic? Can you help our listeners get a general grasp of what that controversy is all about?
Good question. At the time of Epicurus, Aristotle developed up his form of logic. The Stoics developed propositional logic, and Plato had emphasized the importance of dialectical reasoning, but he did not formalize it the way Aristotle did in his writings profoundly. And then the Stoics even made it more profound with propositional logic. And these are attempts to analyze all speech for its reasonability. And so why would the Epicureans oppose it? Well, in part, the Epicureans were more oriented around senses. And being oriented around the senses, they're not so interested in elaborate mental constructs and their analysis. So they have a sort of initial prejudice, just get the data, find out what the senses are telling you, and you'll be content with life, rather than spend your time analyzing sentences as opposed to the senses and try to see how they follow from each other. So that, I thought, was the initial reason why I thought they dismissed it. But then I started working on Epicurean semantics and Epicurean theory of language, and you see some references to it in the literature of Herodotus. Epicurus suggests that different peoples have different ways of using words. Now, in Plato, there's a kind of language of thought from which all other languages are translated into. For Epicurus, he's you might call a multiculturalist. He's living in a world where there's all these different languages. And the Greeks merchants would understand more languages than intellectuals were, but then Latin comes in, and then there's dozens of languages, and they have to deal with people in trading with those languages. And Epicurus argued that the words are defined through the ethne, or habits, of tribes and cultures. And so there are going to be different ways of talking. And when you get different ways of talking, you're going to get different ways of analyzing what's being said, because the language terms are going to be different and the role of those languages is going to be different. So I began to appreciate that Epicurean semantics, and I wrote a paper on this, were anthropological suggestions that when one problem with human beings is that we approach the world with empty beliefs which go beyond what our senses confirm. And we have different ways of expressing these beliefs in different natural languages. And so it's hard for us to communicate with each other, sort of like the Tower of Babel, as it were, from the Bible. And I think for them, just trying to understand what someone was saying in a different natural language was enough of a challenge, rather than attempt to formalize all the things that people are saying in their different languages by a common analysis. Because the common analysis assumes there's a sort of original language of thought from which all the language is translated so that you and I can think the same thought, even though we speak different languages, say. And Epicureans didn't believe that. They saw language as an anthropological phenomenon, and hence producing all sorts of wild and crazy beliefs that all of us have by exceeding what information presents us with our senses. So I think this is an interesting problem because Epicurus uses his words in unusual ways. Now, we all do, because he's writing a couple of hundred years after Plato, or it's a little bit of exaggeration. And it would be as if you're trying to use 21st century language to understand 17th century language. Words change their meaning. So he's used words differently. And then the Stoics after him then used words differently as well, in part by going back to earlier usages that Plato had done. So the languages, the fundamental concepts were constantly in flux in language, as they are today. So logic was designed to produce a logically perfect language where we have complete clarity, no matter what language you spoke, about what you're saying and why you're saying it. And it's the human condition where that won't happen. We never have complete clarity as we go from one natural language to another. When I studied in Germany, I spent 3 years of my life, 1 year and then a 2-year period. People were studying Frege in Germany. And they were saying that the American Frege is different from the German Frege. Because what American scholars using English, Anglophonic people, are translating German words in a different way and writing about what Frege meant as if Frege were writing in English, but Frege wasn't writing in English, he's writing in German. And the same is true in Kant. Kant is extremely hard to read in English, but it's easier to read in German, my experience. But nonetheless, as a non-fluent Anglophone, I'm sure I made all sorts of mistakes in understanding German philosophy, even in German, because my German wasn't good enough. So Epicurus fed into this notion of anthropological diversity meaning different languages, different patterns of speaking. Yes, logic can help with any one natural language to look for fallacies or faulty reasoning. And we can sometimes do that in translation when we have roughly good enough translations. But frequently, logic is a nice thing you can do with a controlled natural language where all the terms are fully known. And we don't have natural languages like that. So I think that's why he also found it a waste of time. But saying that, even if he meant it in hyperbole, would be the hugest offense to the Stoics and Aristotle, because they thought Greek was the only language for philosophy, and they thought you could apply good logic to Greek sentences, and they were right, you can do that, but there are people speaking other languages. At least that's my long-winded answer to that question. But I think there's some merit to that. The philosopher Herder, in the end of the 18th century, began to think that we don't have a language of thought, we just have language. And so our language varies from culture to culture, French versus German versus dialects in German. And so it's hard for us to understand each other because we basically understand things by trying to estimate what that means in our language, not the language of birth.
I find that explanation about the different languages fascinating. Whenever I try and translate anything from ancient Greek, I'm probably somewhat annoying on the forum because I will always give at least like sometimes 2 or 3 words for the same word in Greek, give 2 or 3 words in English to try and get the nuances and the connotations across to people, that because there's so many words, it seems, that have, multiple meanings or multiple nuances that just don't come out if you pick one single English word. So that recognition of the intricacies of language, I think, is very interesting.
I hope you've not been overburdened by reading some of my articles, because you see there's a lot of Greek in those articles.
I love that. So that's been a selling point for me.
Because I did not buy into translating as adequate. And I got that lesson from a wonderful Greek teacher of mine in Lawrence College in Appleton, Wisconsin, who told me that all translation is mistaken because you have to enter into the other mind. And that makes a real challenge to deal with ancient Greek and Latin of that era. And Greek was dynamic. Its words kept changing like English does too. And then there's the illusion that a Google translator will give you perfect understanding of the other words. And it gets really embarrassing sometimes when you get things wrong. And it's even worse in Chinese. My children are Chinese, and their ability to tell me which tones make a big difference entirely in what you're saying. And I'm tone deaf. So I could say, I want to go to the bathroom, and say something else entirely different. It's very funny.
Wow, that's great. I did want to get your take today about, it seems to me that whenever we talk about pattern recognition and we talk about, saying the differences between dogs and coyotes and square towers and round towers, I can grasp that. I can wrap my brain around that. I think one of the things that comes into my mind and some of the people on the forum we've had discussions is whenever we start talking about prolepses of the gods or prolepses of justice. And how do you see that? You mentioned this in your papers, but I was wondering if you give us a take on how you can have prolepses of those sorts of conceptual things as opposed to physical items in the, quote unquote, real world.
Well, Epicurus is in an awkward position. He doesn't really acknowledge the standard gods of the Olympus, but he does acknowledge that we have dreams. And one way to go with dreams is that they're thoughts we have which are being recombined all the time. So they're entirely internal. But Epicurus is living in a world where people would have divination, unusual dreams which would come and strike them as if God was communicating with them. So Epicurus wanted to respond to that as a phenomenon. So I think he had this peculiar epipoletes theanoias aspect as a perceiver, where atoms could affect the brain and affect us in the way we think. And now it's interesting. You could think that certain kinds of radiation can change our neurons and actually change the way we think. But that's not a divine experience of Zeus. It's something that we don't control very well and creates chaos. But he wanted to explain how you could have dreams of the gods. And he wanted to externalize that and say, yes, I'm sure he acknowledges that most of the time our empty beliefs are running through our head, but he also wanted to acknowledge that there seems to be evidence of something hitting us from the outside. So he wanted to give an analysis, an excuse for a world which was extremely oracle-oriented, and say, okay, that's probably because there are these groups of atoms, which we call gods, sending off effluence, and at night, with all your senses shut down, they strike you in your head, and you say, Zeus tells me to sacrifice or to come up with some gold and give it to the oracle, a temple of Apollo at Delphi, say. So I was trying to explain a phenomenon, a cultural phenomenon, I think, and it makes sense to him that the brain could also, for him, unfortunately, it's the heart. Later on, there's an ambiguity between brain and heart in Alexandria era. That's some people differed with that, but generally it affects us. And it affects us because of something happening from the outside. And I think that's what that's about. The bad view of that would be that there's the ability of the mind to understand the world directly in concepts, independent of senses. And that would be totally unacceptable for Epicurus, although a lot of people wanted to see Epicurus as giving in to this conceptual recognition. Gassendi, in some of his interpretations of Epicurus, tries to introduce concepts as well as prolepses to provide a kind of Stoic avenue for mental ideas, because Gassendi was still torn between a mechanistic view and, as it were, a Christian dogma view, which is a Platonic view. And so that worked. I once had a wonderful first edition of Lucretius by Lembinus, which I finally gave away to the Huntington Library because I don't have the right humidity conditions in my house to preserve it. And it was wonderful to read Lembinus as trying to deal with Lucretius as in a Stoic world, and so in Christian world. So he says clearly there's fantasia, which are ideas, because they really admire Epicurus, admire what he's saying, and they don't want him to make look like a fool, and they don't want to get accused of heresy. So they try to twist these things back into a Stoic notion of prolepsis as concepts. The problem is you can't have both. You can't have patterns which are non-cognitive versus patterns which are conceptual. If you have patterns which are conceptual, you're going to dumb down all animals being unable to respond to patterns. If you're going to have patterns, you're going to dumb down human beings at that level of pre-linguistic recognition and say, until you have the word for it, you can't recognize it. And so this is a dilemma. And you could see how people went one way or other on that dilemma. But my interpretation was that for Epicurus, it was fallible pattern recognition, whereas for most everybody, it was the Stoic Prolepsis showed that Epicurus was inconsistent, that he wasn't a thoroughgoing mechanist. Because until really the end of the 20th century, thoroughgoing mechanism was considered to be impossible, nonsense. Now, I work on that topic as a philosopher, not just an ancient philosopher. So if you ever want to read something really fun, get Mark Twain's essay, What is Man?, which is a mechanical account of human nature, which is based on evolutions from Epicureanism by 18th century philosophers in France. But he gives an entirely mechanical account of human nature and a notion of social consciousness where we get all our ideas from outside, and he empties the brain. He meant it seriously. It's a dialogue he wrote, and it's worth, you can get it on as part of a collection of essays called What is Man off Amazon. And it's worth reading because it'll give you a flavor for an Epicurean kind of solution at the beginning of the 20th century, 1906, by Mark Twain.
We will definitely be finding a link to that for the show notes for this one, definitely.
David, I have a feeling that what you've just been saying the last few minutes is just so fascinating that we better hit it as hard as we possibly can. And I'm almost restating what I asked you before, in the sense that one of the principal doctrines says that the wise man is going to conduct his life through reason. And yet what I've just heard you saying almost sounds to me like that Epicurus was rejecting concepts or conceptual reasoning or conceptual logic. Can you explain that just a little bit further about where he was going and what the significance of that is?
Well, two things. One, Diogenes Laertius is not a good historian of philosophy. And so some of the passages he's using were recopied by copyists. And they were trying to constantly correct Epicurus because they liked Epicurus and make him more compatible with the natural view. So more compatible with conceptualism of Plato and the Stoics and Aristotle. But at the same time, Epicurus wanted us to use our reason, use our minds. But what he meant by that was not to have empty beliefs or kenoi thongoi, empty utterances which don't name anything. So he's constantly worried about shibboleths of philosophy as if there's things to be feared about, particularly the gods, that if I don't make this proper worship of Zeus, I will be punished by Zeus. And I should have fear about the future. And the Buddhists say, don't fear the future because it's not the present. And Epicurus is saying pretty much the same thing. But so we use our mind, but we always have to use our minds in a natural language, with the words of that natural language defining our concepts, because our concepts are, as it were, precipitates in thought of the words we use. Try to think without words at all. You can't do that. Epicurus figured this out, but he wanted us to try and sort out the vast majority of our beliefs are false and empty. People believed in all sorts of things. That the misery of the ancient Greeks of the gods, right? There's so many gods, and the Romans made it even worse with even more gods. So you had to worship all these gods, and if something happened to you, you offended a god. And so then you have to be punished for it. The anxiety level must have been enormous. And then there's diseases, there's wars, you could be made a slave any day if an army comes in and captures you, terrible diseases. Life was not pleasant in ancient Greece and Rome. And Lucretius really savors this beautifully in his anthropological books in book 5 and 6 about what life is like. And life is miserable, it's suffering. So how are you going to find peace of mind? Well, you form a community of friends who think alike, who recognizes a mechanical world. You grow your own food. You don't eat elaborate meals. You don't eat much meat. You eat cheese. You befriend one another, care for one another as the world's falling apart. And if you do that, you can find some peace of mind. And then when you're dying and you're suffering, and this people of my age know this very well, you have memories to go back to of being loved and loving others, of peace of mind, of happiness. And this will soothe your atoms and calm your soul. I don't know how Epicurus would have dealt with antidepressant drugs, whether he would have been for them or against them, probably for them, and provided we don't misinterpret them. But the idea was you're living in a suffering world. You're going to use your reason the best you can, but your reason must not get ahead of what your senses tell you and not get ahead of the biases of your natural languages and your own ethnic cultures, because they're filled with empty beliefs.
David, you used the word empty again there now, just so our listeners are clear. What's the difference between empty and wrong?
Empty is the Greek word for void.
So when you say it's an empty belief, does that mean it's a wrong belief?
Nothing there. Just as
Incorrect.
There's think in terms of this, he's a literalist. Atoms in motion in the void. Atoms atomoi, void kenos. That's one word for it. There are other words. So they don't connect to reality. There's nothing there. And he probably reasonably thought, given the superstitions of his time, that the people were just lost in nothing there, here, all over the place. And in ancient Greece, if you've been to rural modern Greece, you'll see all these shrines along the road that people would do who've had bad journeys there, who want protection in dangerous parts of the road. And the Greek landscape was filled with shrines like that because people were afraid a god might be offended by the way they walked or what they said. And then they could also get attacked by people with different political beliefs. And so they wanted to stay away from politicians. And so they wanted to try to live in these sheltered communities, which, as I said, Norman Wentworth was very right about, saying became the model for the Benedictine farm community. Although for the Benedictines, of course, there was a god of another world that we prayed to, but was not, and this world was, in early medieval thought, this world is a vale of tears and misery and suffering. And Epicurus thought there was no other world to go to, so that the suffering that we endure in this world can only be ameliorated by trying to get freedom from stress. And he has a pattern about how to do that.
It seems important to me, David, to recognize that for Epicurus, that this world that has suffering in it, that also applies to animals. Lucretius has a beautiful and very moving passage in his second book about a cow, a mother cow, whose calf has been sacrificed at an altar. And she has all the appearances of being worried and anxious and frankly miserable for the loss of her calf. And it doesn't matter what she does. She goes to the pasture, she goes to the woods looking for her child. She goes to the stall where her child sleeps, doesn't find the calf there. Even seeing other calves, the calves of other cows, does nothing to ameliorate her grief. So it connects with something that is perhaps the most engaging thing for me in reading your papers, is this idea, the distinctions between humans and other animals, between humans and other humans. The distinctions exist, but they're not so great that we can't recognize similar patterns in the way that they approach the world as to the way that we approach the world. So that's my favorite part of everything I've read in what you had to say. And it's reflected here in Book 2 of Lucretius.
Well, Joshua, it's a favorite passage of mine, and that's why I really love Lucretius. He also has some consolation, and the famous passage of consolation, at least to me, it's relative to different people's different reader, was that at the sound of mourning, as people cry, as a loved one dies, there are other sounds of babies crying as they're born, and so life goes on. Not our lives, but life goes on. And I think there are parts of Lucretius where he's sort of like a misanthrope, but he captures compassion, because if we suffer, we know that other animals suffer too, other human beings do. And we want them not to suffer as well. That's our only message: don't suffer. And we can only do that in a limited way because the world's out of control for Epicurus. So he goes off into the countryside, has his gardens, and these different ideal Epicurean communities like Diogenes of Oinoanda's community. And how we're just trying to find a way of living without pain, without suffering, and knowing how to compensate for that. And that means we don't want to take pleasure at someone else's painful expense. We're compassionate. And that means, which was totally, off the wall for most of the ancients, we're compassionate toward animals. We're compassionate toward slaves. We're compassionate to those who are oppressed. We say, why should they suffer? And that's one of the great features of Epicureanism that Lucretius captures very well. And Joshua, your passage about the animal looking for what happened is poignant. It makes you cry because it's the world we live in, and it's painful and cruel. How do we deal with that? For some people, well, we hope there'll be another world to go to. And so the Hindu versions of Buddhism have that, but the classical Buddhism didn't. And in early Christianity, the view was that Jesus had been resurrected, but it wasn't commonly held that we would. But it was a hope that this world, there'll be another world which will be better than the one we're suffering in. That quickly entered into Christian thought. And in the Middle Ages, when Christianity dominated the Middle Ages, one of my favorite poems is a poem which will capture this world. It's a poem a mother would sing to her child this is in Middle English, rocking the child. Lule, lulo, tis the child, lule, lulo, with sorrow comes so in the world, and with sorrow thou shalt go. And the idea was there's got to be some other place where we'll find happiness, freedom of pain. And for the Epicureans, honestly, there isn't. So you have to find it now, and you have to be compassionate to everyone that you can be compassionate to. And you have to avoid situations where you're going to be made to suffer, say by politicians in Athens or in any other place, where you'll be able to find peace of mind. And that's at the core of his philosophy. Atomism is not at the core of his philosophy, although it's right and makes sense, and it's predictive of a future which it took 2,300 years to come into plausibility. But it's the suffering that really bothered Epicurus.
Yeah, he says too that you will sometimes have to choose a particular pain to get a more pleasurable life in the end. But what you're saying about with the suffering, I think is absolutely right, because he says that there might be pain, but you don't necessarily have to have the anxiety and the stress that goes along with the pain. I mean, you may suffer something, if you are, undergoing something, but you don't have to be stressed about it and have anxiety about it.
Yeah, I have to go to the dentist. Yeah.
Right.
In fact, one of my students, oddly enough, she took Epicurus from me, then became a psychologist and a therapist. She works with people fearing dental pain. And a lot of the pains that we fear are made worse. I mean, physical pain, you break your leg, it really hurts. There is terrible physical pain, but we human beings make it worse by dwelling on it, fearing about it. One of my favorite philosophers is Montaigne. But Montaigne lived a lot of his life afraid that he would get kidney stones because his father did. And sure enough, he gets kidney stones. and then he realizes, well, he'd spent more time worrying about it. And it's a terribly painful experience. But he'd made it so much worse by worrying about it for 30 years before it happened to him. We just do this to ourselves,
Exactly.
Speaking of concern, I want to be concerned about Dave's time today. We probably ought to try to wrap up eventually. Well, let me ask one more question that I had really high on the list. When we talk about prolepses and pattern recognition, we often get the question, to what extent is this pattern recognition inherited? Are we born with the ability to recognize any particular patterns? Or is it all something that is developed after we are born? Do you have a view on that?
Well, it's again the two versions. For one, pattern recognition is a kind of behavioral, neurologically learned ability to anticipate the next thing. For the others, it's a concept of primary idea. Take the example of a spider in a web. The spider knows when wind is stirring the web and won't get out of his central haven to go for a wild goose chase or wild wind chase. But they don't know when a fly is in the web. And then he'll quickly go out, stun the fly, spin it up, and bring it back. So spiders are able to anticipate which patterns. They're also able by nature to form webs. How they learn to do this is a kind of combination of what their neurological structure is made of. That's a little bit of their genetic structure is made of. And then their ability to learn how to use it in nature. But they go together. And they take different forms in different species. So some of them have to be native to that species, the way flying is native to birds. But then you have to learn from that in a more elaborate way. What about human beings? Because we do mechanical pattern recognition, but we also do conceptual pattern recognition. And I suspect for us, because we're language users and do that, they sometimes can clash. We think we're seeing one thing, when the pattern we're responding to is different, but in the middle of the night, our thoughts make us see one thing versus what our neurological system is responding to. So I think we are blessed with language, logic, the ability to write and communicate and plan ahead, but we probably have two kinds of recognitions going on: the neurological pattern recognition and then the conceptual classification system. And they work sometimes in tandem, ideally, but they often don't work in tandem because the concepts are malformed, and that confuses us about how to act.
So do you see that spider's web building or the beaver's dam building as being related to this prolepsis mechanism?
Yes, I think there has to be certain anticipation of what to do next. And I think it's entirely reasonable that animals with perceptual abilities and maybe even some plants anticipate some things which are then wrong and make a mistake. And they make the mistake because not they didn't have the right concept, because the pattern wasn't correctly anticipated. I mean, it was a mistake. The pattern recognitions are not true for the Epicureans. They're reliable, but they can be false. Senses are always true to their cause for the Epicureans.
Do you see a genetic transmission of pattern recognition from one generation to another, as with spiders and webs or beavers and dams?
I think there have to be in human brains as well as other animal brains, and they will vary. And I think pattern recognition for people who are neural atypical will be different. But what makes human beings especially challenging to work with is, in addition to pattern recognitions, which are neurological, we also have conceptual recognitions, which is put on top of them. I once wrote a paper, I gave it in Italy, about a case of a woman in Arcadia who was the daughter of some fundamentalists who thought that she was the devil, and they wouldn't let her out of her room. And so they kept her confined to a room. And she finally gets liberated, and various neurologists tried to work with her. She knew very little language, and she had various little limited experience of the world. They eventually got her to use words the way parrots can use words, but they never got her to be able to use concepts conceptually. Her brain was too damaged. But parallel to that, there were also neurological damages that she couldn't see beyond a certain distance. It would just be blur. And that's parallel with people who were blind at birth and acquire sight later on. Their ability to see certain patterns is limited because the neurological parts of the brain had to develop, and they were too late to develop them. So there's neurological development, which takes when you're born and as you grow. And that's true of all animals, and probably in insects, and those patterns get more sophisticated as you learn. Bees are interesting because they have certain patterns they respond to, but they have to learn the dance, as it were, from the hive. They have to learn the assignment that they get in the hive. So gradually there's social interaction that teaches them, that helps articulate or develop these skills that they have. So prolepses can be improved by socialization in bees, animals, and humans. And prolepses can be developed or inhibited by social and sensual deprivation. So there you have it.
Okay, we cannot conclude without asking your view of what Velleius says about everyone being born with a prolepsis of divinity or the gods in Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods. How do you interpret that? And are those images flowing from us to the gods or from the gods to us?
Well, I think for Epicurus, this was mechanical. It explains for certain phenomena we have. People lived in an age where they had unusual dreams. We've all had unusual dreams. And it seems so vivid that something's coming from the outside telling you this. We hear a voice, or we see something. This is part of the way our brain works, especially if it's in between sleeping and waking. And so people have all sorts of anticipations. And so for the Epicureans, this is neurological patterns of atoms, patterned atoms in space hitting us and are responding to them. For the time Cicero's living, prolepsis is often confused with a Stoic concept. Though Cicero is usually pretty good about that, but every now and then he cheats. He takes a Stoic interpretation of Epicurus in order to put Epicurus down. And I've caught him doing that a few times because he's basically a Platonist and he wants to make sense of Epicurus. So that makes no sense. So then he sort of said, well, I'll read it this way. Generosity, really, not trying to skew the deck. But for Stoics and people like them living at the time of Cicero with prolepsis in the common vocabulary, are going to see everyone has a concept of the gods. And by that, they mean a conceptual understanding of the gods. Anthropologically, for Epicurus, well, we get this notion of the gods. Xenophanes once said, the Greek pre-Socratic, that if the cows had gods, the gods would look like cows. So Lucretius understands that. And Epicurus understood the anthropology of why we select the gods we do, except the mistake we make is we think that those ancient Olympians care about us, which they don't at all. We're just getting random broadcasts, as it were, from them. But you have to be careful reading this because our natural tendency is to think of cognitive patterns. And we have to acknowledge, yeah, they exist. But for Epicurus, cognitive patterns are what language does. Class terms, horse, dog, fish, so forth. But we also have pattern recognition, horse, dog, fish, which don't involve words and concepts. Now, socializing of creatures makes it more complicated. We're social animals, like ants and bees and pods of whales, and they may actually develop enough language to be able to produce what we would call linguistic pattern recognition kinds of things. There's rumors that certain kinds of pods of orcas can recognize enemy and produce this sound saying enemy around. And that's understandable to them because they speak the same language, and it wouldn't be understandable to a shark, say. So the two are separate, but they can easily get confused.
I will say one of the things I find really interesting from what you've been saying, David, is that I think that whenever it comes to the canon, the famous, infamous statement that all sensations are true, I sort of blended into the prolepses, but I think it's really important what you've been saying is that while sensations are true to their cause, the prolepses are not necessarily infallible. So I think that just that single point there, I think has been very helpful for me to sort of wrap my brain around that.
Yeah, Epicurus, in a reliable source, does not say that all prolepses are true. It's been misinterpreted that way.
Right.
The epibole destinoias that affect us from the outside, they're true to the cause there. It's a physiological claim. Prolepses involve the senses getting partial information and then projecting what's going to happen next, not intellectually, but almost neurologically. And it was important to figure that out.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
That's right. It does.
One more thing, since you did a really wonderful job of talking about the prolepsis of the gods a little while ago, but I wondered if you would address the idea that we can have a prolepsis of justice or a prolepsis of fair play or prolepsis of, that other one that is specifically mentioned in the text. If you have a sort of a way that pattern recognition and justice can be we have a prolepsis of that.
Yes, if you have pets and you give one pet some treats and don't give the other one, the pet who's not getting those treats feels mistreated. Now that's a prolepsis of equality. Justice in Greece often meant equality before the law. Dikaiosine, balanced, everything balanced. And so you could have a notion of justice learned phenomenally from seeing creatures treated differently. In animal kingdoms, animal groups, some animals are treated better than others. And so that produces irritation in response to the animals who are being treated less well. Chimpanzee colonies, primate colonies, my cats better treat them both well, or some bad response will happen. So I think there can be prolepses of natural justice, but it's natural to think of it as a theory of justice, which I don't think that's what it means. There's also some dispute about the text and what it really says. And so you have to be really careful about this. Prolepsis of human experience is, we know what war is, and we know what injustice is, we know what cruelty is, and we know this both viscerally and also linguistically. And there are cases where we know it viscerally, but try to talk ourselves out of it intellectually. Well, that's not really being cruel when our various bones and sinews know that that's what it is.
Well put. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that.
Now, I've enjoyed speaking with you. I hope I haven't talked too much. I hope I haven't digressed too much, but do get a copy of Mark Twain's What is Man? You'll enjoy that. And if you're interested in the problem of language and translation, there's a great philosophy book to read by Willard Van Orman Quine, written in 1960, called Word and Object, in which he talks about the untranslatability of languages from across natural languages. And it'll show you the sort of thing I think that Epicurus was thinking about. Or also, I got to thinking about it because I knew Quine, and so he got me to impose it on the text when it's not there. It could just as well be the case.
It's now on my want to read list. So
thank you for forming this group. I wish you well, and thank you for being interested in work I wrote 40 years ago and making me feel younger than I am.
David, thank you again for joining us on this. We're going to get it put out on the internet for the benefit of people coming along in the future who hopefully can learn something from you. They're not going to learn so much from us, perhaps, but when we find people like you who know what they're talking about, we want to help get that word out there. It's such a challenging and confusing subject. I hope we haven't worn out our welcome totally with you. I know we have today because you're on the West Coast and probably have not eaten lunch yet, and we're on the East Coast, most of us. But thank you for all of your time today. We hope to continue to be in touch with you. And if there's ever anything we can do for you, please let us know.
Good. And I think it's admirable you have this group, and may you prosper, as they say. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much again, Dr. Glidden, for all of your assistance. And we'll be back soon for another episode of Lucretius Today. Thank you very much.